Hi all, I have a very interesting game to show you from the Biel tournament in round 6. I believe this could be considered the game of the round. For me it was the most exciting game in any case. David Navara, who had been involved in that magnificent game in an earlier round where he moved his king right into the corner on h8 as white, was now playing white against Michael Adams. So Michael Adams I've known as he's come up through the ranks because he's a British player. It was absolutely fantastic to witness some of his games where he completely destroyed people in UK chess. So now he's a super grandmaster, 2740. He's actually higher rated than David Navara, 2724. So he's playing with the black pieces. We see David Navara kicking off with the English opening, and Michael Adams actually plays e6, wanting a transposition actually into standard Queen's Gambit decline territory. And actually we do get that after knight c3, d5, d4. So perhaps white is not too bothered to try and keep it distinctly as the English opening. Now we have a classic Queen's Gambit declined, and white plays actually the exchange variation here. C takes d5. So we have e takes d5, bishop g5, c6. So this structure, I think, is known as the Carlsbad structure. It's prone to a minority attack when later white plays for b4, b5 sometimes under the right circumstances. And black, with this structure, reinforces control of the light squares and has that e file to play with, that semi-open e file. Okay, so here we see e3. And now the most common move, according to Livebook, is bishop e7. That's the most trodden path, over 2,000 games. Knight bd7. Here we see slightly more unusual h6. It's got a specific idea. Bishop went to h4. Bishop e7. And now often white is playing either bishop d3 or this move that was played, queen c2. Now in this position it's a bit too early to consider trying to exchange off this bishop. This would be a mistake to play knight h5 here, I believe, in this position. I don't want to absolutely check this before I say it, but it looks as though bishop takes e7, and there's a little tactical trick here available to white. Can you see it? If I give you 5 seconds. Yeah, white has knight takes d5. That loose piece there. So that's not particularly good. So black actually he doesn't want a castle here though, although castling does seem entirely reasonable in this position. Michael Adams actually played knight bd7 here, and now this knight h5 is on the cards as a way of exchanging off the dark square bishop. We see that here, bishop d3, knight h5, kind of frees black's game a bit. This exchange, and if the bishop refuses, then there's knight takes g3 if the bishop doesn't take on e7. So we see bishop takes e7, queen takes e7. Now with this exchange of dark square bishops, it's interesting that theoretically the dark squares of both sides have been slightly weakened. We see knight ge2, knight b6. So still not castling, but maintaining a kind of grip on the light squares, opening up this bishop. Now both sides do castle. Rook a e1. And it looks as though the standard plan for white would be to try and break in the centre later with f3 and e4. We see bishop e6. So the f3 e4 plan seems like the standard sort of thematic thing to do, but maybe white wasn't convinced by this. With the exchange of dark square bishops, for example, it seems as though maybe the f4 square would be useful for black, or the dark squares generally. White actually played knight c1, perhaps trying to emphasize the c5 square later, which looks like fairly standard as well as a plan against this structure. If white's not playing for that minority attack, this looks to be a mixture of plans to maybe get a knight first to c5 and then try and do something in the centre later. Rook a d8, kind of prophylaxis against any e4 later. That d4 is going to be under fire. knight b3. The knight's looking to c5. That c5 square, it looks very like standard positional. Rook fe8, and now knight c5. Yes, the bishop drops back. So black's position does seem geared against e4, because now there's also that knight f4 to pounce in as well. White played b4 here, as though, yeah, a minority attack might be on the cards with b5. This is often like a precursor, you know, the b pawn's shielded with that knight maneuver first, and then b5. It seems entirely logical. But there's a balancing act here, because black has a little bit of theoretical counterplay now on the king side, which he completely taps into with his next move. It's probably one of the strongest moves, actually, I would say, even like theoretically. It's a great move in the circumstance against a thematic minority attack. If white is allowed to play b5, yes, that's going to be a potential problem. I mean, if a move like a6, then maybe a4, and then, you know, b5 still happens. So, you know, black's got to be very careful about b5. I think e4 is probably less to worry about here. Yeah, just imagine this position. I think there's always knight f4, for example. That makes this whole e4, you know, a bit of maybe less effective, because it's kind of pinned. That pawn, you know, if takes, then rook takes, then queen takes e1 is actually just winning. So this minority attack plan is the more dangerous one. But this knight c4 does actually create some counterplay based on the unique configuration of white's pieces, actually, that this rook's kind of hemmed in. You might not think this is a great detail, but actually it really does seem to be quite an important detail. At the moment, yeah, why not just take and try and use that pawn, you might think. Well, white actually does make use of the knight here with this double attack, queen e2. Now, if he did actually instead try and exploit this by taking, he's giving up his light square bishop. This move, there's a good counter here to this double attack, which is similar to the game, queen g5. It's looking for bishop h3, threatening mate, and if g3, then taking the exchange. So this is one of the big problems about the position generally. And here, if like f4, again, this bishop h3 is a potential nuisance. Takes. In this position, bishop h3 is still a nuisance, because there's things like knight takes f4. So these variations show that actually it's not so easy for white to exploit this bishop's this potentially loose pawn. He does play queen e2, pardon me, after knight c4, queen e2. Then we do get this counter, queen g5. So the basic idea, this bishop h3 is tactical counterbalance for this c4 knight. White now is tempted here to play f4, and there's still some counterplay for black in this position. After the move queen h4, it's not so easy to win this c4 pawn. Though the queen is now looking at e1, there's actually some tactical coordination going here, which is very, very interesting. Black is immediately, of course, now threatening rook takes e3, as well as knight takes e3. This e3 point's loose right here. So white does snap off the c4 knight after d takes. You see a certain tactical point here emphasised, that if queen takes c4, there's knight takes f4, with that coordination on e1. And if rook takes f4, then it's a loose rook, queen takes e1. And if e takes f4, then there's rook takes e1. So yes, this works very well, this queen h4 move, and a nuisance to white. So with that nuisance, yeah, what does white actually do? technically, I mean, maybe black has already kind of equalized. It's a strange equilibrium, making use of this configuration here. But technically, the engine is suggesting queen takes c4, knight takes f4 to actually go into this with, say, the move king h1. The idea now, g3. But this is just, black is at least equal here, it seems, this position here. It's interesting that black has kind of equalized and got a nice stable position with some prospects without moving too many pawns. Say on the king side, he hasn't created too many weaknesses. It's fascinating that the classic minority attack has been counterbalanced. So anyway, white kind of is irritated with the queen on h4 and actually plays a move which carries quite a lot of risk, maybe much more than anticipated, to play the move g3. Can you see what Michael Adams played now in this position? If I give you 5 seconds starting from now. Okay, it's a really fantastically powerful move. Knight takes g3. Yes, he's exposing David Navara's king, which in a previous round was sort of invincible. Someone said as if King Arthur was on the king's side, it was totally invincible. But here, is the king invincible? After hg, queen takes g3 check. The king maybe thought it was after king h1. Technically best now to minimise the damage is the immediate queen g2. This wasn't played. Queen g2, black at least gets 3 pawns for a piece and looking to win a 4th pawn here. So 6 pawns already. 3, 4, 5, I mean 7 pawns against 4. 3 pawn advantage already. It's okay. It's better for black here. This is actually a really difficult position for white. It has to play accurately. But this actually makes it even worse, king h1, because there's now this move queen h3 check, and white is kind of compelled to play queen h2 here by force, because if he plays king g1, can you see what black has, which is actually really direct and crushing in this position. Black to play here. This is a variation. What would you play here with black? If I give you 5 seconds. Okay, just a rook lift. And yes, even though Navara's had magical experience of his king in an earlier round, here, it's not going to be so magical after rook g6. The king's going to get splatted. What does white actually do against this to defend against rook g6? Say here, it's a splat, mate in 3, like this. If here, queen g2, mate. Yes, this is not possible. f5, black just takes on f5, and still rook g6 is happening. So that actually means that queen h2 is virtually forced, and this is under worse circumstances than earlier. In fact, slightly worse after rook takes e3. It's an improvement. It's just clearly better for black. He's got 3 pawns for the knight, and d4 is loose, and he's got pressure on c3 here. So he's actually threatening rook takes c3 immediately. White really can't even take the queen, you know, because of the check and taking on c3. So he plays actually knight d1. And in this position, black took on e1, just favouring some simplification, because he's going to get another pawn. So it's but first, before playing rook takes d4, stronger it seems is what is played, b6 to kick the knight back first. I think rook takes d4. Well, it leaves the b7, that's the problem. Why leave b7? So yes, kick the knight first. And now it's really 4 pawns for a knight. This is not a good outcome for white. e4 pawns, yes, the knights are not looking as though they're going to coordinate with the rook for a mating net here against black. We see king h2, bishop f5. There's immediate pressure on these knights. They're supporting each other here for a moment. Now rook d3, and black really wants to play something like b5, and then later try and maybe play for the two connected passed pawns of a5 and b4, stuff like that. So this is really dangerous. White actually played b5 here, and this doesn't really help white. C takes b5, knight takes. We see bishop d7. Now if the knight just returns back to c3, then the pawns maybe can consider rolling soon, but maybe even more accurate is just to try and win material with f5. Yes, ouch, that will just be winning one of the knights if this knight moves. So that's not possible. And yes, if knight takes a7, rook a3, ow, the knight is stranded. So this isn't good. This isn't good news. Oh dear. Oh no, this f5 or this trapping the knight. So a4, this knight's not looking too healthy in this position. a6, now winning potentially now another pawn. Although the knight has got c7, the a4 pawn, and could it have done that earlier here, you might ask. Knight c7, yes, that is possible, it seems, but again it's not particularly pleasant here. After say bishop c6, bishop c6 or f5, black is really in the driving seat here, and this knight doesn't, again it seems almost like stuck. Black's threatening stuff like this. So yeah, we see the miss move a4, a6 nudging the knight to c7 but losing another pawn. But knight takes a6, okay, regaining a pawn, but we've got two connected passed pawns here. But even worse, c3, and this pawn's actually quite dangerous even without this fellow pawn. So here in this position, c2 is really quite dangerous with the idea of rook d1, c2 and rook d1. White plays knight b4, but a fantastic move again from Michael Adams, showing great accuracy here. Really accurate super move in this position. If I give you 5 seconds, what would you play with black? Really accurate. Rook d4, hitting this knight again. Okay, it goes to a2, and the point, can you see the point here? Which is very unfortunate tactically for white. Black to play here, and it's the final move of the game. Rook d2 check. Ouch. Forking. Forcing white to resign, really. It's not particularly good, this position. After takes, knight takes c3. Here, black is 3 pawns up. And if takes, this is really unfortunate. C takes, forcing a queen. There's no check. The bishop's also covering e8. So yeah, a beautiful final move. I'm sure this is the sort of game which I'm sure will bring a smile to Mickey Adams against fellow Super Grandmaster 2724. He's beating David Navara here with black. I'm sure that causes some happiness. So fantastic game against someone whose king is not that invincible, as this later round shows. So David Navara involved in that amazing game in an earlier round as white he got his king to h8. But here, yes, a more mundane game perhaps in some respects, but yeah, great play from Michael Adams. In my opinion, fantastic game. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.